"You can try," Victoria Harrington said, smiling beside her dead Bentley. "But if factory engineers couldn't fix it, I doubt a one-bay mechanic can." Everybody in that glass car pavilion laughed. They saw a black single dad in a faded work shirt, grease under his fingernails, and an old tow truck parked outside her billionaire estate. They did not see the man who had spent 20 years listening to engines whisper what rich people paid experts to ignore. Her Bentley Mulsanne sat there like a black coffin on polished marble. I almost walked away. My daughter Ava was waiting at home with her science project spread across our kitchen table. Then I opened the fuse panel and saw one tiny $5 fuse sitting where it did not belong. That fuse wasn't the problem. It was a message. And before sunrise, that message would expose a secret buried inside that car for years. My name is Marcus Reed, and for most people, I'm easy to overlook. I own a small repair garage outside Macon, Georgia. One bay. A leaking roof over the storage room. A coffee machine that worked only when it felt like it. Nothing about the place looked impressive. The sign above the door had faded so badly that half the letters were barely visible. But that garage fed my family. More importantly, it gave me a way to keep a promise. 5 years before the night I met Victoria Harrington, my wife, Danielle, passed away after a long battle with heart disease. There are losses that hit you like a storm, and there are losses that settle into your bones and stay there. Danielle was the second kind. For months after the funeral, I moved through life like a machine running on damaged parts. I went to work. I paid bills. I smiled when people expected me to smile, but inside, something had stopped running. The only reason I kept moving was my daughter. Ava was 6 when we lost her mother. She was 11 now. Smart. Curious. Always asking questions nobody else thought to ask. Most afternoons, she sat at a small folding table in the corner of my garage doing homework while I worked. The customers loved her. The old-timers brought her candy bars. Truck drivers brought postcards from different states. And every once in a while, she would wander over to whatever engine I was working on and ask a question that forced me to think differently. "Dad, how does a car tell you it's sick?" That was one of her favorites. I remember laughing the first time she asked it. "A car doesn't talk, sweetheart." "Yes, it does," she said. "How it makes clues." I never forgot that. Machines leave clues. That's all diagnostics really is. Listening carefully enough to hear them. The afternoon before, I received the call from Harrington Estate. Ava was sitting at her table building a science fair project. It was a model bridge made from craft sticks, glue, and more determination than engineering. Next to it sat a small toy Bentley she had found years earlier at a thrift store. The toy was scratched and missing one wheel. She loved it anyway. I was finishing work on an old Rolls-Royce restoration for a retired dentist when Ava held up the toy car. "Dadya, if one tiny part breaks, can the whole thing stop working?" I smiled. "Sometimes. That seems unfair." "Maybe." She thought about that for a second. Then she said something that would stay in my head long after. "Maybe the tiny part is the most important one." At the time, I thought she was talking about the toy Bentley. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. Because less than 24 hours later, I would find myself standing inside one of the richest estates in Georgia, staring at a real Bentley worth more than my garage, my truck, and my apartment combined. And sitting inside that Bentley was a tiny $5 part that nobody else had bothered to understand. I didn't know it yet, but that little part was about to change everything. The call came the next morning. At first, I thought it was a prank. The woman on the phone introduced herself as an assistant from Harrington Estate and asked if I was available to inspect a Bentley that several specialists had failed to repair. I almost said no. Shops like mine don't usually get calls from billionaires. An hour later, I was driving through iron gates taller than my garage. The estate looked less like a home and more like a private museum built to remind visitors how much money they didn't have. Manicured gardens stretched across rolling hills. Marble fountains sparkled in the Georgia sunlight. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of old money. The kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. When I parked my aging tow truck near the main pavilion, several guests turned to look. Not at me. At the truck. Their expressions said enough. Wrong vehicle. Wrong clothes. Wrong man. I had brought Ava because school was out for the day and I couldn't leave her alone. She stepped out carrying her backpack and quietly followed me. A few people looked surprised. One woman actually asked an assistant if we were part of the maintenance crew. I pretended not to hear it. Ava heard it too. She pretended not to hear it better than I did. Inside the pavilion sat one of the most impressive collections of luxury cars I had ever seen. A Ferrari, a Lamborghini, a pair of vintage Rolls-Royces, several rare Bentleys, and at the center of them all sat a black Bentley Mulsanne Grand Limousine. Beautiful, silent, dead. Victoria Harrington stood beside it. She was elegant, confident, and carried herself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. When she shook hands with the collectors and executives around her, she smiled warmly. When she looked at me, her expression became more cautious. Not hostile, just doubtful. "You own the garage?" she asked. "I do." Her eyes briefly moved toward my work shirt, then toward my truck outside. Then back to me. "I've already hired Bentley engineers, diagnostic experts, and restoration consultants." I nodded. "I'm aware. They all failed. I heard that too." A few people nearby chuckled. Victoria folded her arms. "If you can make it start, I'll personally admit I was wrong." Someone behind her laughed. Another voice added, "That's a safe bet." More laughter followed. I glanced toward Ava. She was standing quietly beside a display case, pretending to study a model car. But I could see her listening. My child was watching. That mattered more than the opinions of everyone else in that room. I walked toward the Bentley. The polished black paint reflected the ceiling lights like dark water. There was something strange about it. Not the engine, not the body. Something else. Something hidden beneath all the luxury and silence. I opened the driver's door and climbed inside. A minute later, I reached for the electrical access panel. And that's when I decided to start where nobody else apparently had. With the fuse box. I have learned something after 20 years of turning wrenches. Most people start with what looks expensive. I start with what looks ordinary. The Bentley's engine compartment was spotless. Too spotless. Every connector looked new. Every wire harness appeared untouched. The diagnostic reports sitting on a nearby table were nearly 3 inches thick. Bentley engineers had inspected it. Electrical specialists had inspected it. Collectors had inspected it. One report claimed the fault was inside a control module. Another suggested replacing half the electrical system. A third recommended shipping the vehicle back to Europe for further analysis. All of them agreed on one thing. The car shouldn't have been sitting silent. Yet there it was. I spent the next hour doing something none of the spectators found very impressive. I looked. I listened. I checked. The crowd slowly lost interest. That was fine with me. Good diagnostics rarely look exciting. Victoria remained nearby, watching from a distance. Every so often, someone would approach her and quietly ask if she really believed I could succeed where factory-trained experts had failed. Her answer was always polite, but it wasn't encouraging. "He's welcome to try." Not exactly a vote of confidence. Meanwhile, Ava sat at a small table in the corner of the pavilion drawing in a notebook. Every time I glanced over, she gave me a small smile. No pressure, no expectations, just trust, the kind only a child can give. Around mid-afternoon, I finally opened the electrical access panel beneath the dashboard. That's when I found the fuse. The same fuse I had noticed earlier. $5, maybe less, nothing special. Except for one detail. It didn't belong there. I removed it carefully and checked the markings. Wrong specification, wrong factory code, wrong amperage rating. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong enough. I looked at it again, then again. The more I stared at it, the less sense the situation made. Bentley engineers don't overlook something that basic. Neither do restoration specialists, which meant one of two things. Either everyone had somehow missed it, or someone wanted them to miss it. That thought stayed with me. I reinstalled the fuse temporarily and continued tracing the circuit. A strange pattern began to emerge. Several systems that should have communicated with one another weren't doing so. Not because they were broken, because they were being interrupted. Almost as if somebody had intentionally placed a roadblock inside the electrical network. I leaned back in the driver's seat and closed my eyes for a second. My late wife used to tell me something whenever I got frustrated. "Stop looking at the problem," she'd say. "Look at the person who created it." At the time, she meant life, not cars. But the advice worked surprisingly well for both. Because suddenly I wasn't asking what had happened to the Bentley. I was asking who had touched it. And why. When I opened my eyes again, I noticed a faint tool mark hidden near one of the access brackets. Fresh. Deliberate. Human. Someone had been inside this car before me, and I was beginning to think they hadn't been trying to fix it. The moment I started treating the Bentley like a crime scene instead of a repair job, everything changed. I removed the fuse again and carried it into better light. Most people would have looked at it and seen a $5 part. I saw a question. The markings were subtle enough to fool almost anyone who wasn't paying attention. The fuse matched the physical dimensions of the original factory part, but the internal rating was slightly different. Not enough to immediately disable the car, just enough to interfere with several communication systems over time. That wasn't an accident. That was planning. I spent another hour tracing every circuit connected to that fuse. The deeper I looked, the stranger the story became. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing appeared burned. Nothing appeared worn out. The Bentley wasn't acting like a sick machine. It was acting like a machine being prevented from speaking. I know that sounds strange. But when you've spent most of your life diagnosing mechanical problems, you learn the difference. A broken system leaves chaos. An interrupted system leaves patterns. And this car was full of patterns. Late that afternoon, Ava walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. One for me. One mostly filled with sugar, the way I liked it. She handed me the cup and glanced toward the Bentley. "Any clues?" I laughed. "You sound like a detective." She shrugged. "You always say machines leave clues." I looked back at the car. "Yeah. Did you find one?" For a moment, I considered explaining everything. Instead, I smiled. "I think I found the first real one." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Kids don't need all the answers. Sometimes they just need to know you're still looking. After she walked away, I climbed back inside the Bentley and removed part of the lower trim panel beneath the dashboard. That's when I found something that made the back of my neck tighten. A hidden fastener. Not factory. Not documented. Not mentioned anywhere in the service records. Someone had installed it later. Carefully. Deliberately. I checked the surrounding panel. The material showed tiny signs of repeated removal and reinstallation. Whoever had been there knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't amateur tampering. This was precise, professional. And suddenly, the wrong fuse made perfect sense. The fuse wasn't there to destroy the car. It was there to keep people from looking deeper. I sat quietly in the driver's seat for a long moment. Outside, wealthy collectors mingled around Ferraris and Lamborghinis. Inside, I was beginning to suspect that the most valuable thing on the estate wasn't any of those cars. It was whatever somebody had worked so hard to hide inside this Bentley. The sun was beginning to set when I carefully examined the concealed mounting point again. Behind it, I could feel empty space where no empty space should have existed. A cavity, a compartment, something hidden, and for the first time all day, I stopped thinking about how to make the Bentley start, because I was starting to believe the car wasn't broken at all. The car was hiding a secret. I didn't open the hidden compartment that evening, not because I couldn't, because experience had taught me something important. When a secret has survived for years, rushing usually helps the wrong people, so I stepped away from the Bentley and gave myself time to think. The estate staff began preparing for dinner. Collectors drifted toward the main house. The pavilion grew quieter. For the first time all day, I found myself alone with my thoughts, and with a memory I hadn't visited in years. Almost 15 years earlier, I had worked at a restoration shop in Atlanta. Back then I was younger, louder, and a lot more convinced I already knew everything. One afternoon, a customer brought in a classic muscle car that nobody could diagnose. The owner had spent thousands replacing parts. Nothing worked. Everyone kept chasing expensive explanations. I found the problem in less than an hour. A damaged connector worth less than $10. I still remember what the shop owner told me afterward. Most people look where the money is. Good mechanics look where the truth is. That lesson followed me through every stage of my career. It followed me through business failures. It followed me through long nights after Danielle died. And now it was sitting beside me inside a billionaire's Bentley. Because once again, everyone had been staring at expensive answers. Meanwhile, a $5 fuse was quietly pointing somewhere else, toward the truth. As darkness settled outside, I walked back to the guest apartment the estate had offered us for the night. Ava was sitting at the kitchen table finishing her science project. The little toy Bentley sat beside her notebook. One wheel missing. Still loved. She looked up when I entered. "You found something." It wasn't a question. I smiled. "How do you always know?" She shrugged. "You get quiet." That made me laugh. She wasn't wrong. When I'm confused, I talk. When I'm close to understanding something, I get quiet. Ava studied my face for a moment. Then she said something that stopped me cold. Mom used to get that look too. For a second, I couldn't speak. There are moments when grief sneaks up on you years later, not like a punch, more like a hand on your shoulder. Gentle, unexpected, real. I sat beside her and looked at the half-finished bridge on the table. "You remember that?" She nodded. She always got quiet when she was figuring something out. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that repaired engines, The same hands that held my wife's hand during her final days. The same hands now chasing a mystery hidden inside a Bentley. And suddenly I remembered the promise I made after Danielle passed. No matter what happened, no matter how much money was involved, no matter who was standing across from me, I would always choose what was right over what was easy. The next morning, that promise was about to be tested. Because hidden behind that compartment was something far bigger than a broken car, and I was finally ready to find it. I was back inside the Bentley before most of the estate had finished breakfast. The pavilion was quiet, just the way I liked it. No audience, no commentary, no wealthy spectators waiting to see whether the garage mechanic would embarrass himself. Just me and the car. I removed the hidden fastener carefully. Then I eased the interior panel away from the frame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard a soft click, a mechanical latch. Old-fashioned, intentional. The panel shifted slightly. Behind it was a narrow compartment hidden deep inside the structure of the limousine. I sat perfectly still. People don't build compartments like that by accident. Someone had wanted this space to remain invisible. I reached inside. The first thing my fingers touched was a small brass key. Old, heavy, worn smooth from years of use. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I reached back into the compartment. This time I found a folded envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Written across the front in neat handwriting were 4 words, for Victoria. If found. My pulse quickened. I wasn't looking at a repair problem anymore. I was holding part of someone's final message. I immediately stepped away from the vehicle and requested that Victoria join me. She arrived a few minutes later with several estate staff members. One of them was Charles Whitmore, the longtime estate manager. I noticed him the moment he entered. Not because he said anything, because of the way he looked at the envelope. Most people looked curious. Charles looked worried. The difference mattered. Victoria stared at the handwriting. For the first time since I had met her, her confidence disappeared. "That's my husband's handwriting," she whispered. The room became silent. Carefully, she opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Not long. Not dramatic. Just a few paragraphs written by her late husband shortly before his death. The note explained that a second item had been hidden for safekeeping. The brass key. And that key opened a private lockbox known only to him. If anything ever happened to him, Victoria was supposed to find it. She looked up slowly. Why would he hide this inside the Bentley? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Yet. But while everyone else focused on the note, I found myself watching Charles. His face had gone pale. Not frightened. Cornered. The difference mattered there too. Years of working around people had taught me something. Machines aren't the only things that leave clues. People do it all the time. A glance. A hesitation. A reaction that arrives a second too late. Charles was reacting like a man who already knew this compartment existed, which meant he probably knew why the Bentley had been disabled. Suddenly, the wrong fuse made even more sense. The car had never been protecting a mechanical secret. It had been protecting this, the key, the note. And whatever waited inside that lockbox, Victoria looked at me. What do we do now? I glanced toward Charles, then back toward the note in her hands, and for the first time, I realized the Bentley wasn't hiding the final secret. It was only pointing toward the person who was. By noon, the atmosphere inside Harrington Estate had completely changed. The Bentley was no longer the center of attention. The note was. Victoria had already arranged for the lockbox mentioned by her late husband to be located. It sat inside a private archive room beneath the main house. Only a handful of people had access to it over the years. One of those people was Charles Whitmore. That fact seemed to bother him more with every passing hour. I was standing outside the archive room when he approached me. Alone. No audience. No billionaires. No collectors. Just the two of us. "Marcus," he said, forcing a smile. "You've done impressive work." I nodded politely. "Thank you." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "Some discoveries create unnecessary complications." The sentence hung in the air. I already knew where the conversation was heading. "You think so?" "I think certain matters are better left in the past." There it was. Not a threat. Not exactly. More like an invitation. The kind offered by people who believe everything has a price. Charles slipped a business card from his pocket. On the back was a handwritten number. A large one. Larger than I earned in several years. "Walk away," he said quietly. "No interviews, no questions, no opinions." I stared at the number, then at him. For a brief moment, I thought about everything that money could do. A larger garage, new equipment, college savings for Ava, a safer future. The temptation wasn't imaginary. It was real. That's what makes choices difficult. The wrong decision usually comes disguised as an easy solution. Charles must have seen hesitation cross my face. Because he smiled, he thought he had already won. Then I looked through a nearby window. Outside, Ava sat on a stone bench reading a book. Completely unaware of the conversation, my child was watching this story unfold. Maybe not this moment, but eventually she would know what kind of man her father chose to be. And suddenly, the decision became very simple. I handed the card back. "No." His smile disappeared. "Think carefully." "I already have." "Do you realize how much money that is?" I nodded. "Do you realize how expensive dignity becomes once you sell it?" For the first time, Charles looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not angry. Exposed. The conversation ended there. A few hours later, Victoria approached me herself. She looked exhausted. Grief and suspicion had replaced the confidence she carried when we first met. "You could have made a fortune today," she said. "Maybe." "And you turned it down." I glanced toward Ava. "Money matters." Victoria nodded. "Then why refuse it?" I thought about Danielle, about promises, about garages, about children watching their parents. Then I gave the only answer that felt true. Because I didn't come here for the money. I looked toward the Bentley sitting quietly across the estate grounds. I came because the car was trying to tell me something. Victoria followed my gaze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. By sunrise, the lockbox would be opened, and whatever truth had been hidden for years would finally belong to everyone. The lockbox was opened at sunrise. Victoria, her attorneys, several board members, and a handful of trusted advisors gathered inside the archive room. I wasn't supposed to be there, neither was Ava, but Victoria personally invited us. "I think my husband would have wanted the man who found the truth to see it through." Those were her words. The brass key turned smoothly. The lock clicked. And years of secrets finally came loose. Inside the box were documents, financial records, handwritten notes, and digital storage drives. At first, nobody spoke. Then one attorney began reading. A second joined him. Within minutes, the room changed. You could feel it. The documents detailed years of hidden financial transfers, unauthorized accounts, missing assets, millions of dollars that had quietly disappeared through a network of shell companies. Every trail led back to one person, Charles Whitmore, the estate manager, the trusted advisor, the man who had spent years standing closest to the family. Victoria sat down slowly, not because she was weak, because betrayal is heavy, especially when it wears a familiar face. Charles denied everything at first. Then the evidence kept coming. Page after page. Transfer after transfer. Signature after signature. The truth didn't need anyone to raise their voice. The documents spoke for themselves. By mid-morning, attorneys had contacted investigators. Charles was escorted from the estate. And just like that, a secret protected for years finally collapsed. But there was still one thing left unfinished. The Bentley. I walked back to the pavilion carrying the correct factory fuse, the same tiny component that had started this entire chain of events. Collectors gathered again. Employees gathered. Even Victoria came to watch. This time, nobody was laughing. I removed the wrong fuse, installed the correct one, reconnected the interrupted circuit. Then I slid behind the wheel. The cabin fell silent. I turned the key. For a second, nothing happened. Then the Bentley answered. The engine came to life with a deep, smooth rumble that echoed through the pavilion. People applauded. A few actually cheered, not because the repair itself was dramatic, but because everyone understood what it represented. The car had never truly been broken. It had been silenced, just long enough to protect a lie. Victoria stood beside the driver's door as I stepped out. There were tears in her eyes, not from the car, from the note, from her husband, from finally understanding why he had left the clues behind. Then something happened that surprised me. She turned toward Ava, not me, Ava, and said, "Your father never stopped looking." Ava smiled proudly, the kind of smile every parent hopes to earn at least once. The applause continued around us. The Bentley was running. The truth was out. Charles was gone. But the most important thing that happened that day had nothing to do with money, luxury cars, or hidden accounts. It happened when my daughter looked at me and saw exactly who I had chosen to be. 2 days later, Ava and I were back where we belonged, at our little garage. The Billionaire estate was behind us. The Bentleys, Ferraris, and marble hallways were already becoming memories. The familiar sounds of impact wrenches and air compressors had returned, and, honestly, that felt right. I was closing up for the evening when Ava carried her science project onto the workbench. The bridge was finally finished. So was the little toy Bentley beside it. At some point during the week, she had found a replacement wheel and repaired it. I picked it up and smiled. "You fixed it." She nodded proudly. "It only needed one small part." I laughed. "Of course it did." We sat together for a while as the Georgia sunset spilled orange light through the garage doors. Neither of us said much. Sometimes the best conversations happen in silence. Then Ava asked the question I should have expected. Was the fuse really the important thing? I turned the toy Bentley over in my hands. No. She looked confused. But everything started because of it. That's true. Then why wasn't it the important thing? I thought about Victoria, about her husband, about Charles, about promises, about truth. Then I gave her the answer. The fuse mattered because it pointed to something bigger. She considered that, like a clue. Exactly. Ava smiled. She liked clues. Then what was the important thing? I looked around the garage, at the tools, at the grease stains, at the life we had built after losing Danielle, and finally at my daughter. The important thing was paying attention. She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than most adults. Maybe she did. Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Victoria Harrington. She wanted to thank me one last time, not for fixing the Bentley, for helping her find the truth. She also offered to fund a complete expansion of my garage. A generous offer. Far more generous than I expected. I accepted part of it. Enough to improve the shop. Enough to create opportunities for future apprentices. Enough to help secure Ava's future, but not enough to forget who I was. When the call ended, I stood quietly in the empty garage. The same garage people once dismissed. The same garage that taught me where truth usually hides. Not inside expensive things. Inside overlooked things. A $5 fuse. A handwritten note. An old brass key. A promise made to a wife. A lesson shared with a daughter. People often ask me what I learned from that Bentley. The answer is simple. The most important things in life rarely announce themselves. They whisper, and if you're willing to listen, they can change everything. Because the truth is, the Bentley was never the thing that needed fixing. People were, and sometimes the smallest part in the room carries the biggest truth of all. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been judged before someone truly knew who you were? Have you ever had to walk away from money because it wasn't worth the cost? Or maybe you've discovered that one small detail, a conversation, a note, a promise, or a tiny decision ended up changing your entire life. Share your story in the comments below. I read far more of them than you might think, and your experience could encourage someone who needs it today. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories about fathers, family, dignity, second chances, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. And remember, never underestimate the value of small things, because sometimes they're carrying the biggest truths